I received a letter the other day from Alice Wiley, retired secretary for the Iowa Highway Patrol. It was in regards to the passing of Bud Crane, childhood hero of many back in the 50s in Avondale, Iowa. Although Bud and I have been good friends, I've had no contact with him for almost 40 years. The notice was short, but I decided to fly back home the next day for services. Afterward, I met a polite young man named Jimmy Clymer. He said he was Jake Clymer's grandson and that Bud had worked for his granddad for almost 50 years at Jake's garage. That Bud had never married after Laverne's accident, and he'd had a small shop near Harnton and lived in a room in the rear. Jimmy asked me if I'd like to look around town, and I agreed. We stopped and bought some film and headed towards Clymer's old garage, now a radiator shop. It still looked pretty much the same as I had remembered. I asked about Pop's Tavern, and he told me that it burned to the ground in the 70s and was never rebuilt. We looked south from the shop over the bridge towards Trenton, past the graveyard where so many young people were buried so many years ago. Jimmy asked me if I'd like to retrace Bud's famous Trenton run. I agreed, and we headed towards the S-turn underpass where the boys had been killed over 50 years ago.
SIT meeting in the library.
He told me that the 90-mile curve had been displaced by the new bypass built around Avondale in the 60s. We continued on past the crossing that Bud had beaten the Rocky Mountain Rocket that night, and on through Harnton and Blairsville, and finally into Trenton. We tried to retrace Bud's return trip down the back roads and finally ended up at his place just outside Harnton. We stopped to take a couple of photos of his shop and some projects that Bud had never gotten around to. And then finally, we made it back to Avondale. Past the church where Bud's services were held, past the road to Laverne and Marge's places and the old jalopy track, all gone now, and on to Jake Clymer's new garage. Arriving finally to take Jake Jr.'s place where Jimmy said he had some things to show me he thought I'd be interested in. He told me that when they moved to their new garage, Bud and he had taken most of Bud's stuff to his dad's place. Out behind the shed, there it was, Bud's disassembled coupe. I couldn't believe it. After 50 years, I was looking at the same old coupe that was roaming the streets of Avondale back in the 50s. He told me he had some other things to show me, a 427 power coupe that Bud had built him. It came as no surprise. Bud was still building real hot rods. He showed me Bud's first jalopy racer with Bud's name still barely visible above the door. It was almost 7:30 and getting dark and starting to rain, and Jimmy said he had one last thing to show me. He opened the door to the shop and rolled out Bud's last project, a restored jalopy racer that Bud had raced back in the 50s. I told him I kept this photograph of the terrible wreck that night in the glove box of my patrol car for the next 30 years. Sometimes when I stopped a teenager who had been driving recklessly, I would pull out this picture and tell him the story of the kids who died that night. I hope some of them listened. He thanked me for helping him to retrace Bud's famous Trenton run, and I thanked him for bringing back many memories from a long time ago. We said goodbye and promised to keep in touch. I thought to myself as I walked back to the motel the hundreds of lives that Bud had influenced with his love of cars. He will be missed by everyone who had the good fortune to know him. Sincerely, Ted O'Day, Sergeant, Iowa Highway Patrol, retired.